Hey, Sean Bice, how are we doing today? It's Paul Carruthers, and this is MotoAmerica's weekly podcast, Off Track. Today we have a special guest. I've got a little story to tell about this guest because him and I go way back, as you know, Sean. But John Ulrich
Yes,
was
you guys
John.
have known each other forever, haven't you? You guys, I mean, it's scary how long you guys have known each other. They were steam powered motorcycles in those days, I think, weren't they?
Well, actually, in the time that we've known each other, they invented tires that hold air. Anyway, so John Ulrich and I have known each other since, since I was like in probably high school or college is probably the first time I saw him like at the racetrack when I was a kid. And then when I graduated from San Diego State, I happened to see John. I'd like to say it's probably Laguna Seca or something. And then he was asking me what I was doing, and I told him I was getting a journalism degree and blah, blah, blah. And he showed a little bit of interest in it at the time. And then as it worked out, a year or so later, he actually called me and said, "Hey, could you cover a race for us for Cycle News?" I think actually it was ATV News, the first one. And I'm like, I have no idea what I guess let's give it a go. So I covered a race for him. I think like I said, it was an ATV race first because we had ATV News back then. And then shortly thereafter, he said, could you cover the Sears Point Road Race National? And I was like, holy crap, what am I getting myself into, right? I mean, back then they had like a zillion classes. I'd never really done it before. And again, I said, yeah, what the heck? And I went up there and did Sears Point for John, and he obviously liked it enough that after that, there was an opening on the staff at Cycle News, and he called me up to see if I'd be interested. And I went up there and interviewed with him. And lo and behold, he hired me at Cycle News. So that was 1985. And obviously, I've known him ever since. He was my boss for a while at Cycle News. I learned a lot from him. I owe him a lot for bringing me into this. Well, sometimes I curse him for bringing me in, but most of the time I thank him for bringing me into this, what has been a great career for me and something I've really enjoyed and something I've had a lot of passion for. John and I have had our ups and downs, but it's okay. I think we disagree on some things, but I think one thing we both agree on is we both have a passion for motorcycle racing. And, it was easy for us to have some difficulties in the past because really we were competing. I was the editor of Cycle News and he's the editor, it was and is the editor of Roadracing World. So, but yeah, it's been, I've known him for, I can't even think of when I didn't know him, put it that way. So we've had a lot of times together. And I remember my first day at Cycle News, and back then we had typewriters and he was, it took him like the first day before he was yelling at me like, Carruthers, I need a caption for page 56. And I'm thinking, how long is the caption? How many words do I write? What do I do? So I'm just kind of looking at past ones and counting the words and the characters and trying to come up with captions so he wouldn't yell at me. But it was trial by fire, and I got thrown in the deep end, and obviously I must have learned how to swim pretty quick because I ended up having a long career there at Cycle News. But anyways, let's bring John into the conversation here. John, how are you today?
I'm doing good.
Was that accurate, my story, or not?
It was close
enough. It's been so long. Close enough, right? No one would know if it wasn't except for you and me, so we're good.
I didn't remember the ATV race part of it, but I remember Sears Point.
Yeah, I went to, it was some race in Dallas or something, some Mike Kidd ATV race. I don't know. Okay. But the Sears Point one was a little more impactful because, and believe it or not, I mean, talk about full circle. I remember that day talking to Wayne Rainey and Fred Merkel, and I think Wayne won the Formula One race and Merkel won the Superbike race. And here we are, however many years later, and we're both still working with Wayne Rainey. So not so bad.
There you go. Yeah.
That's amazing. So here's a question for you. So how did the transition? Because obviously, eventually, Paul, you had the job at Cycle News that John had, but you didn't replace John, right?
John had already left and started and worked for, I think it was it American Road Racing and then Road Racing World. So John was gone before I took over. I took over from Jack Mangus, not from John.
Okay. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, John. John, there are a few titles that you've been involved with in motorcycle racing over the years. And I mean, American Road Racing, I was a big fan of that for a long time and have a lot of issues of that, just like I do a ton of old Cycle News and a ton of old Road Racing World as well. So I got to go back and look at those. Your name's all over all of that stuff. What else? Were there other titles?
Yeah, sure. I worked for Cycle World for 6 years, and it was funny because I remember going to a press conference that Kenny Roberts was doing. I can't remember exactly why, but during the press conference, I'm sitting there, and as part of my job at Cycle World, I'm in charge of this section called Race Watch, and I'm stuffing it as full of road racing as I can all the time. At the same time I'm doing this, I'm racing, mostly with AFM and with Wira. And so Roberts starts complaining that the motorcycle publications in the United States don't pay enough attention to road racing. And then he says, and when they do something on it, they just stick it in Race Watch. So I'm sitting there thinking, you bastard, I'm doing everything I can to put road racing in that magazine, and you're giving me a hard time in front of a bunch of guys that don't do anything. Anyway.
That's about right.
That sounds about right for Kenny, though.
Yeah, wow. That's funny. But yeah,
go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, so at the same time I was working at Cycle World, I missed the immediacy. I mean, I'd started freelancing for Cycle News when Art Friedman was the editor, and that was at the time. Let's see, that was August of 1972. I'd gotten out of high school earlier that year. I was looking at Cycle News. They had big pages. They had a lot of pages. I thought maybe I could try selling them something. And I'd try to sell some other stuff to magazines, most of it like really bad fiction. So I did a nonfiction story, sent it into him with photos, captions, headline, text, and I got a check. And I went, like $40. I couldn't believe it. I just wrote about motorcycles, which is what I wanted to do in the first place. And I got a check for doing it. So I changed my major. Well, I just started college, so I didn't really, or was just getting ready to start college. So I didn't actually, wasn't actually working on anything except the general education stuff. But I changed my aspirations. So what I thought I was going to do was go to college, get a degree, go to law school, be a lawyer. And then after I got money for writing about motorcycles, I switched to communications, and then, went through the whole drill and ended up with a degree in communications, emphasis news journalism, which was an interesting experience in itself. But anyway, I liked the immediacy of doing the Cycle News thing. And while I was going to college, I worked part-time at Cycle News. And at one point, the lady who owned Cycle News, Sharon Clayton, said to me, why do you keep going to school and trying to do this degree? We like you just the way you are. You can work here, no problem. I said, no, I really want to get my degree. So I got my degree and then went to work for Cycle News full-time for basically twice the amount of money they offered me before I had the degree. So that was an interesting thing. But the other thing was that I'd go into a journalism class, especially my last couple of years of college, and the professor would say something like, is there anybody here who's sold anything or had anything published? And I'd raise my hand. Other people would raise their hand. They'd say, yeah, I sold something to the local newspaper, etc. So by this time, I'd been doing a lot of freelancing, and I'd sold stuff to 14 different magazines in the United States and overseas, in Spain, Italy, France, Australia. And so I said, hey, I've sold like 250 different things to 14 different magazines. And the guy would say, oh my God, including 17 magazine. I sold him a story I did on a girl motocrosser, some 17-year-old girl who was motocrossing with some success, named Dolly something. Anyway.
Oh yeah. Wow.
So he'd say, what magazines? I say, Cycle News, Cycle World, Cycle Guide, Revs Australia, blah blah blah. And he'd say, and wave his hand like it didn't count. And I always wondered, like, how does a word know what kind of story it's in? If you're writing a sentence and it makes sense, what does it matter whether or not it's about motorcycles or local trash collection? You know, and I was, that's how I was getting money. I was paying for school and buying my books and paying for gas for my street bike by selling stuff all the time. And I had to sell stuff. I had to sell stuff constantly. Also had a job delivering prescriptions for a pharmacy, which I did on my street bike. And I'd, go to school, come home, go to the pharmacy, deliver prescriptions, come back home, write stuff, send it off, sell it. So it was interesting also that in journalism school, they'd say things like, well, if you want to sell something to a magazine, you send them a query letter and tell them what you want to write and ask them if they want to buy it, which nobody ever responds positively to, because a guy could write a great query letter and write a terrible story. And if you told him you were going to buy it, then he wants you to pay you for something that's useless. So my approach was always write it, take pictures, and I took some photography classes and bought a bunch of photography equipment to make sure I was able to do that. And I'd send it in the whole thing complete. It didn't have to think about anything to publish it. It had the photos, it had the captions, it had the headline, it had the stories. A lot of times guys change the headline, but as long as I got a check, I didn't care. So, and the other thing is that I was club racing at the time. And for a long time, this friend of mine, Rudy Galindo, who was AFM #1 for a while, I was still living at home, going to school. I had a street bike, didn't have a car, bought a race bike. And Rudy would come over to my house and pick me up Saturday night after he got off work. We would drive all night to Sears Point, for example. We would show up at the front gates of Sears Point. As the gates opened, we would come in, park, unload our bikes, go through tech, race, load everything back up, drive back all night. I'd get back. I would process my Tri-X film, dry the negatives, write the story. As soon as the negatives were dry, I'd pack them all up. I'd take my typed pages, jump on my street bike, ride to Cycle News in Long Beach, deliver them, go to school. So it was it was a very interesting time, but it turned out well. I mean, I'm still totally immersed in motorcycles and road racing 24/7 every day of the year. And I'm really happy that I was able to make a career out of something that I really love.
Yeah, it was definitely different times. I mean, back to that original Sears Point story I did for you guys. I mean, this is how different things are now than then. I was going to school and living in San Diego, and I believe I took a flight to LAX. Somebody from Cycle News, back at the time, obviously no screening or TSA or anything like that, was able to meet me at the gate. I handed them the film and the story, typewritten story that I'd stayed up all night working on because I was so nervous about getting it right. So somebody was actually able to walk to the gate without a ticket, take my story and my film, go back out, get on their motorcycle, ride down to Long Beach to give the stuff to John. And then I would continue my flight down to San Diego. So it was like, not to mention, I don't think they'd let somebody on a motorcycle deliver prescription drugs anymore, right, John?
Yeah, I don't know. I remember there was a race I did, I think it was 84. And I wanted to do something different than I was doing at Cycle World. And so there was an opportunity to run Cycle News' editorial department in Long Beach. And as you mentioned earlier, at the time they had, Cycle News coming out every week. They had ATV news coming out every 2 weeks, and they had all-terrain vehicle industry coming out every 2 weeks. So basically there was at least one issue going out every single week. No, sometimes 2 issues a week, because the weeks we were doing the ATV thing, et cetera. Anyway, there was a lot of stuff going on. So I got hired to do that. And it put me right back into the thick of motorcycle racing. So I went and covered this race at Laguna Seca, and I'm watching qualifying. I'm down in the pits, and I'm watching Kenny Roberts and your dad, Paul, Kel. And Kenny comes in and he says to Kel, I need 5 millimeters more preload. and Kel gives him 5mm more preload on this YZR 500, whatever model it was. And he goes out, and his first flying lap after that, he takes pole position, sets the fast lap, and it was really impressive. Wins the race, and so I fly back to Ontario, drive to Long Beach, go into the office, open it up, go into my sit down to my typewriter, and I write the story. And the lead is basically the conversation that Kenny had, and then it went on from there. And finished the story just as the sun was coming up, and off we went. So very interesting time, a lot of exciting stuff happening. And I'm still here, I'm still alive, I'm still in business. It's a good thing.
You still get to experience those hectic deadline days.
Yeah, they were.
And John, the thing I don't want to miss this thing. Kenny literally said 5mm on the preload. He was that specific about it.
Yeah, and when he got what he wanted, he went quicker. And I've seen guys over the years who can do that, but that was the first time I actually saw somebody do that. And since that time, one of the guys who obviously I've worked with since then, who was so specific, and for example, asked for a C5 valving stack and some forks, Olin C5 stack, and got them back and did one lap and came in and said, that feels like a C3. And we went back to the Olin's guys and said, hey, are you sure this is C5? And took them apart, and they said, no, it's a C3. And that particular guy over the years has been really, really specific about stuff like that, and can ride something and say, this needs this needs this is doing that. And it's a little known fact with him, and it's been underreported and underappreciated, but it helps him in his current gig, which is testing motorcycles for Roadracing World, and that's Chris Ulrich. And over the years, there's been times when he's said something about a motorcycle, and a mechanic has said, no, that's not true, blah, 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 but he's been proven right. There was a lot of examples over the years, but the only guy that I've been up close and personal with and seen that play out like that, other than that first time with Kenny, was with Chris from pretty early in his career. But he's ridden over the years. He's raced and ridden so many motorcycles at so many tracks, and talked to so many engineers who designed the things, and ridden on so many different types of suspension that he's developed that ability, which I like it. So
yeah.
Well,
John, you've worked with a zillion riders in all these years. Are they still, is a motorcycle racer today still pretty much the same as a motorcycle racer 30, 40 years ago? It's just different technology.
Well,
when it comes
there's a lot more stuff.
are they a lot different?
There's a lot more stuff to adjust, and there's a lot more stuff you can do. And when I was racing a lot, when I went endurance racing with Bruce Hammer, I had gone to Suzuka and raced in the 8-hour on a Milwaukee Kawasaki, and the suspension wasn't very adjustable. It had a few adjustments, but one thing I noticed at that race was that David Aldana seemed like he was going better than me, and he was having less problems with his bike, which was identical to mine. And so I said, hey, give me exactly the same stuff David's got. And it actually made a difference. But over the years, the adjustability has increased. And now you have to understand the electronics. And so now what we have is, for example, we've got this, obviously, I own Team Hammer. It's still running, and racing with MotoAmerica. And we have this kid, one of the latest hot rod kids that we've started to work with is Sean Dillon Kelly. So when he came, when we started working with him, it looked like he was going to come to the team, and we took him testing at a postseason test at Barber at the end of 2018. He was coming from the Red Bull Rookies Cup. He had no experience with using data acquisition and using it to figure out what he needed to do or adjust the motorcycle, et cetera. So Chris spent a lot of time teaching him how to do that and working with him so he could figure out how to do that. So that's a new that's a new skill that riders need to be able to, look at the data, and now you can overlay the data from one guy with another guy. They can see that this guy's, turning on the throttle, 5 feet before he is, or, 30 feet or whatever it is, and use that to improve what they're doing. And what we found is that having riders who can do that without being threatened, or feel like, oh, I'm giving something away and I want to beat this guy. Guys who can cooperate as teammates and can work together and compare their stuff, both of them go faster. And so we, that's a real important skill the guys have to have now. They also have to be able to, take coaching advice, because now there's been a big rise in coaches in racing. Now everybody has a coach, basically, who's going good. Everybody needs a coach. I mean, Valentino Rossi has a riding coach. So sometimes, in the past, guys were just figuring it out on their own. They weren't cooperating. They would crash some guys would crash the endurance bike because they wanted to turn a faster lap than their teammate. Even, they'd be a couple laps ahead, and then somebody would crash the thing and come in and say, well, at least I turned the fastest lap, which actually the only real answer to that is I don't give a blank about that. I want to win races, So it's the guy who's successful now has got to deal with stuff and more stuff and think about more stuff than the guy in the past. On the other hand, guys in the past would just make stuff happen. If the motorcycle couldn't be adjusted to suit what they wanted, they would just figure out a way to do it. Or if they had a problem, they would just figure out how to ride around it. One of the best examples ever of that was John Hopkins. The AMA Pro Formula Extreme Championship was on the line. It was the last race of the season at VIR. And he had, the bike had adjustable triple clamps with these inserts that you dropped in. You could move the stem, you change the stem tilt, move it back and forth, etc. And a pinch bolt holding that thing in broke, and the design obviously wasn't a good design. They're clamps we bought from an aftermarket company that made clamps. The top insert fell out, so now the steering stem can move forward and backwards almost an inch. So all of a sudden he's racing for the lead of this race. He has to win this race. If he doesn't win it, Simon Buckmaster is going to win the championship. At the time, he's like 18 years old, I'm going to say. I think he was 18 that year. And so we're looking on the TV monitors, and all of a sudden the front of the motorcycle is chattering like crazy in some corners, and he's like going backwards. So we're going, what the heck is going on? And then all of a sudden it stops chattering as bad, and he starts moving forward, and he finishes where he needs to finish to win the championship. And later he told us that he didn't know exactly what his problem was, but he knew that the bike acted different when the gas was on than it was off. So he started working on keeping it on positive throttle all the time, which isn't all that easy a thing to do, but he did it. And that's an example of a guy who he didn't really actually understand what was happening. He just knew what the motorcycle was doing relative to his throttle inputs and what he was doing. So he just changed what he was doing and made something happen.
Wow.
So, that's working with a lot of young guys over the years has been, really important for me. It's been a big deal, and I've enjoyed it. We work with a lot of really good riders, and Josh Hayes, for example, his first professional ride was with Team Hammer. There's so many guys that came through the team and went on to, have great careers. I'm really, really proud of that. One of the guys that we helped reignite his career was Martin Cardenas, and I really, really liked working with Martin. He was a really good guy. And we won 25 races with him, and he came along right when the Spec Tire deal started. So prior to that, we started off being a Dunlop team, but there were 2 tiers of tires that Dunlop supplied to people. If you were one of the anointed few teams, you got the A grade stuff, and if you weren't, you didn't. And if you didn't have it, you were a second and a half behind when you got to the track. And even though you sped up, everybody else sped up, so you were still a second and a half behind when you left the track. So as a result, trying to be competitive, we had to try Michelins and try Pirellis. And so right at the end of that whole time, we were racing on Pirellis. Martin was riding for us. He finished second and third a lot in 600 Super Sport. And he beat everybody in the class, but not all at the same, never all on the same day. So what would happen was he could lead 3/4 of a race, the Pirellis would go off, the Dunlops wouldn't go off as much. Dunlop guys would pass him, and then we'd finish. Okay, so the next year, AMA Pro Racing adopted spec tires. And so Martin, on the exact same motorcycle, with the exact same crew, riding for the exact same team, went from winning no races to the next year winning 9, and he would have won the championship if he hadn't crashed and broken his hand late in the season. And then the next year he won 10 in the championship, and then he ended up winning 2 championships for us in 25 races. And the first year after spec tires came in, he won 5 in a row, and we were getting torn down. His motorcycle was getting torn down every race. So the tech guys tore it down 7 race weekends in a row, and it was legal. They never found anything because we weren't cheating. And guys were saying, "Oh, they're doing something. They're doing this. They're doing that." No, we had really good motorcycles, and as soon as we had the same tires, then it was really on. So that changed everything. So then that's when we started winning a lot of races, and we won the 600cc class 3 years straight. And that was not an easy thing to do, racing, teams like Graves Motorsports with Josh Aaron. So I'm really proud of that. We won twice with Martin and once with Danny Eslick.
Yeah, that was good. Hey, Paul, I want to ask John this question. That's going to probably be it's a complicated question, but I wanted to see if you could put this together for us, John. You had mentioned Bruce Hammer and Team Hammer, and we talk quite a fair amount and label in our social media Team Hammer quite a bit for your team. And it occurs to me that maybe people don't know the origin of that. And I also want to talk to you about, in your long career as a journalist and also as a racer, you've always been a very big proponent of safety. Obviously, we're involved in a dangerous sport here, and you've been very involved in safety advocacy over the years. And so I kind of wanted you to talk a little bit about Bruce Hammer, Team Hammer, and then what you think about how the safety is being handled within MotoAmerica now, and your involvement with the Road Racing Action Fund and the air fence and all that. I know that's a huge amount of stuff, but it sort of all fits under this idea of you being a big proponent of safety. Can you talk to that, please?
Yeah, that's a big topic. But
Yeah.
Basically, I came back from racing Suzuka in 1980, and I used to hang out at this motorcycle shop near the Cycle World offices called Champion Motorcycles. It was owned by 2 guys, Lee Fleming and Whitney Blakesley, and sometimes Bruce Hammer would show up in there. And he was they handled Yamaha and other stuff. I think he was getting some parts for his TZ 750. He actually finished second in AMA Formula One on his own TZ 750 in that year, 1980. So I came back and I was talking to him at the shop, Champion Motorcycles, and I said, "Hey man, you won't believe these endurance bikes they've got over there." And I'd done some endurance races basically on superbike type stuff. Like in 1978, I went and raced a 4-hour at Aspen, Colorado, and my teammate was Charlie Hennekim, who's now he works for the FIM and is in charge of technical stuff. And we rode a KZ 650 superbike that he borrowed from a friend of his. Drove to Aspen, Colorado, and ran that race. So I'd ridden endurance races on various types of production bikes. But when I went to Suzuka, I was riding a proper Formula One chassis endurance bike, had a chrome ollie frame. It had what was at the time was good suspension, and it was had a good team and had quick fills and everything. So the bike was awesome. And so I came back and I'm telling Bruce, I go, "Man, if I could get one of those bikes over here, we could win a lot of endurance races." And I liked endurance races. I liked the extra team component. I liked the long periods of time you got to ride. I liked strategy. I liked the whole thing. I liked it a lot. And he said, "Well, I'd be interested in doing that." And I said, "Really? Well, great. A chassis will cost like $2,500. You want to put up half the money?" Now, I'd asked this question to several other guys since I got back from Suzuka, and every one of them said, "No, man, I'm not going to put any money in it. You want me to ride? You got to pay for everything." And so Bruce was the first guy who said, "Yeah, I'm interested in doing that." So we started this thing called Team Hammer. And, you know, Team Hammer was a catchier name than Ulrich. Team Ulrich doesn't sound as good as Team Hammer. Team Hammer sounds awesome. Okay, so we started Team Hammer. So we got this chassis, and then we tried to borrow or get a deal on a Kawasaki engine, and you know, we couldn't. And at the time, I was friends with Terry Vance, and he said something about, well, let me talk to Tosha Suzuki and see if I can get you an engine. So talks to this guy Tosh Koyama, a longtime racing manager at Suzuki, and he gets us a GS 1100 engine, which is a better engine than the KZ 1000 anyway at the time. They were both air cooled, but the GS had 4 valves per cylinder, and the Kawasaki had 2. So we got the engine. Vance and Hines built it in like 1176. We put it in the bike. We drove to, we're at 4 hour at Savannah, Georgia. We raced the bike. We had some problems that involved the carburetors getting blown off the motorcycle when it backfired, getting bump started. And then we wore a front tire down to the treads and didn't have a really good quick change setup on the bike at that time, and ended up finishing, I don't know, 4th or something. But we brought the bike back to California, decided, you know, looked at the engine, and the 1176 or 1196 was a little bit too much, right? It was thing was running kind of hot, didn't look too good inside. So then Byron Hines built another one, which was 1176. And we sorted out all the quick change stuff on the bike, went to another race. I think it was at Bridgehampton, and won. And then we went to Roadracing and won. And then we went someplace else and won. And we also that year, which was 81, we finished second in an AFM 6-hour at Riverside behind Eddie Lawson and Ron Pierce, who were riding a Muzzy Kawasaki. And they had a special $500 award for the fastest pit stop. We won that. So I was pretty proud of that. I was real happy with the guys who were helping us. And I was really happy to stand on a podium with Eddie Lawson. That was really cool. I got a picture of that, and it's one of my favorites. Anyway, so we had this team going. So then for 82, and to back up, I was sitting in my office one day after Bruce and I decided to do this team, and I got this phone call from this guy. And he said, "Hi, my name's Harry Walker. I work for Chevron, and we're coming out with a line of motorcycle oils. And I was up at an AMA National at Sears Point, and I saw, a guy running around with a TZ 750 with CalGuard on it, which was an oil company and a coating company. And so I'm looking for a team to sponsor. Do you know of anybody?"
Oh, wow.
Who might be able to, might be interested in that. And the CalGuard bike that he saw, it was Bruce on his TZ 750. Okay, so we put together this proposal, and Bruce pitches them, and we get a Chevron sponsorship. First motorsports they'd been involved in for a long time, and the first time they're involved in motorcycle racing. So the bike had Chevron on the side of it. Okay, so then for 82, we round up some more money, and Bruce decides we should, Bruce is really interested in building a 4-stroke F1 bike, because AMA was going towards 4 strokes in F1, so to campaign instead of his TZ. So we built a custom frame here in the United States. We had Rob North build it, and Bruce went racing with that. Had some kind of problem at Daytona. Then he went to Roadramerica, and he crashed and slid head first with his head up into an Armco barrier outside the carousel. And somebody else had crashed before that and cleaned out the hay bales. That's the one report that I got. So there weren't any hay bales there. He hit the Armco barrier and broke a vertebrae in his neck and turned himself into a quadriplegic. And I found out about that. I got a phone call from his then wife, who called me and said, "Bruce crashed. He'll never walk again. It's your fault for talking him into riding those 4 strokes." And it's like, holy cow. And then, so then Bruce gets airlifted back to California, and he's in Rancho Los Amigos, which most of the people in that place, it was a spinal injury recovery place. Most of those people were there because of the leading cause was shower falls, and the second leading cause was gunshot wounds related to gang warfare in Los Angeles. But there Bruce was, and his wife bailed immediately. She told him that she didn't get married to be a nurse. And
wow, that's rough, John. That's hard.
Yeah, it was. So that was tough. So and around about the same time, I mean, Honda had a tryout, and I don't know the exact timing on this. I can't remember, but Honda had a tryout for their Superbike team, which this concept was really bad. This is a really bad idea. I'm sure they thought it was good at the time, but it was a bad idea. So they rented Laguna Seca, didn't put up a single hay bale, and they invited different guys to come and ride their Superbikes. And the guys who were fastest, did best, were going to get a ride. That was the concept. So John Woo, who was a friend of ours, a privateer guy, shows up for this thing, and he crashes in what was then turn 2 at Laguna Seca, which was just a really fast left-hander, and not very far off the edge of the track was this sheer embankment, like a cliff almost. And John crashes, and he goes into tire wall or whatever there is in front of this cliff, and he's killed. He's dead. And prior to that, Eddie Lawson had crashed an F1 bike during a F1 National at Laguna Seca, and had crashed in the same place. There were hay bales, and he thought he'd paralyzed himself because he told me he was lying there and he couldn't move his legs, but it came back. So it was like shock instead of permanent damage. So at that time, if we went somewhere, if we went, let's say to Sears Point, which is one of the worst places we went, it was a total death trap. There was like 2 places you could crash on that track and not get seriously damaged, into some hard stuff, whether it was an Armco or some other kind of wall or an embankment, whatever. And later, Russ Pauck, who was a really good friend of mine, one of the closest friends I ever had, was riding one of my bikes and crashed at Sonoma, and in this little left right flick coming out of turn 7, and went into the embankment. His bike followed him in and hit him in the chest and killed him. And so at that time, if you went to a track and you said, hey, could we get some hay bales here so that if we crash here, we don't die? The typical answer was, get the blank off the property and never come back. If you don't like the safety conditions of this track, you leave now. So all this is happening. So already, too many of my friends, too many guys I know have been killed or maimed. All sorts of crazy stuff would happen. We had a case at Brainerd where the pit entrance, you'd go partway down the straightaway and turn 90 degrees left into the pits. And there was a guy there, a worker, who was supposed to wave you across if it was okay to, cross the track at a 90-degree angle and come in. Well, the riders didn't want to do that. They figured out that was dangerous as hell. And so some guys got together and they cut the chain link fence outside the last corner. They started running off the track at the last corner and going through this hole in the fence into the pits because it was a lot safer. And the AMA at that time was really autocratic institution and would say stuff like, you guys ain't organized enough to tell me what to do, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it was a really bad time for riders. Nobody was looking out for the safety. If you said anything, they threatened to ban you, pull your license, et cetera. So one of the ringleaders was Hugh Humble, TZ750 guy. So he, the AMA guys threw a fit and they closed the gap back up in the chain link fence. They threatened to take away Hugh's license. I talked to his dad after he was killed, and his dad said, he called them from the track just distraught, saying, Dad, they're going to take my license. They're going to keep me from racing. And anyway, he was on track later. They went back to the crazy pit entrance, and so Mark Jones is doing a plug chop or something on his TZ750. So he's coasting along right side of the track, and the guy who's supposed to, make sure it's clear to cross waves him across, and he turns left 90 degrees, and out of the mist comes 3 guys on TZ 750s at full tilt, and 2 of them miss mark, and 1, Hugh Humble, hits them, and they're both killed. And that was the kind of stuff that went on. I mean, it was crazy. And when Russ was killed, I didn't even get all the parts of the motorcycle back. I still have the sheared off steering stem and the engine hangers with the elongated bolt holes in them from the impact. I have them in a box at my office, and the broken clip-ons and stuff. But I didn't even get the gas tank back. The guy who was running AMA Pro's race at the time threw the gas tank away because it was totally smashed, and said something like, well, they're not going to need this. Well, who are you to make that decision? These guys had such a cavalier attitude towards anything. It was really, really bad. So we decided, okay, we're going to try to start something. And guys had tried to get riders together on stuff before and failed miserably. So we started this thing called the John Woo Memorial Safety Project, and we had guys sign these things. We were trying to do a collective bargaining thing. We were going to go to tracks and say, okay, we represent these guys, and we want you to do some track improvements, track safety improvements. This is like 83-ish, somewhere around there, 82, 83. So a lot of guys sign up, some guys didn't. And we sent a local guy to Sears Point to go talk to them, and they threw him off the property and banned him. And so there was the AFM final was coming up, and he couldn't go to the race and race. So one of the guys who was a member or had signed up for this John Woo Memorial Safety Project thing was a lawyer named Art Chambers. And so he said, well, they can't do that. It's a public event. They can't keep him from coming. So he filed some kind of injunction and got an injunction that said that they needed to let this guy come and race at the AFM finale for the year. And the track canceled the race rather than let him come in. And, the AMA was against it. The tracks they didn't want to hear it. And like I said, the answer was, you don't like the safety conditions here, get off the property. And I heard that as recently from the guy who was running AMA Pro Racing. Last time I heard that was from the guy running AMA Pro Racing in 1999. And again, talking about Sears Point and available practice and restrictions AMA had on who could do promoter practice on Thursday. And so, I had a kid at that time, Hopkins, who had never been to Sears Point. And he was at Daytona earlier that year, and a whole bunch of guys crashed. And so that put him in the top 10. That was the first race of the year. Okay, so now he's in the top 10 for points. So they had this stupid thing that said if you're top 10 in points, you can't practice on Thursday. So I called him up and said, hey, listen, man, come on, give me a break here. Kid's never, he accidentally got in the top 10. He's never been to Sonoma or Sears Point. It's kind of, it makes it less safe for everybody if the guy can't even know where he's going before the start of official practice. And he said, if you're concerned about safety at that track and you don't think that what we're doing is the right thing, don't come and don't send your team. And that was the way it was. So I got all this floating around in my head, and my team's running, and we have Grant Lopez racing in Formula Extreme, and he crashes. We're running at this track at Phoenix, and he crashes and he hits a concrete K-rail, and he's helicoptered away. And I'm standing there looking at his mom and his sister, and they're asking me what's happening, what's going to happen to Grant, and I don't know. And when I talked to the AMA guys, the race director, I said, why didn't you have hay bales there? He said, oh, no one's ever hit there before, which is like, that's not an excuse. So I got all this, this stuff was building up. It was building up, and something had to be done. So this guy in Australia started building these pre-inflated airbags called air fence. And the basic concept was that they had inflatable ribs and a structure which created an ambient air chamber, and it had blow-off valves in the top. You could put this in front of something, and somebody could hit it, and the air would come out of the ambient air chamber at a controlled rate, and it would absorb the energy. It works just like a car airbag, except it's pre-inflated. And so one day I decided that I'd had it. I'd had it with the bullshit. I'd had it with the excuses. So I did an editorial on roadracingworld.com, and it basically said, hey, I'm going to buy a section of this stuff. Who's with me? And it actually worked out. There were a lot of people who responded to that. We raised over $100,000 really quickly. And the AMA put out a press release saying, oh, we have a plan to get air fence, but it takes 4 months to get it, so we can't get it before the end of the season, but we're gonna do this. Now, a couple years later, I ran for the AMA board, and I had access to the minutes of the executive sessions, the executive session minutes, as well as the general session minutes, and there was no plan to get air fence. That was a lie. You know, that was they just had their guy at the time who was doing press releases for them, which I'm not going to name him. He's still in the business, you know, wrote this press release, which was just a lie. And so what I did was, at first I thought, okay, we're going to like sell advertising on the front of these things, and that's how we're going to pay for them. And that's how I learned all about trackside signage rights. So that wasn't going to work. And so we raised the money, and it was coming in $5 from this guy, $1,500 from that guy. I put in like $1,500, which is what one of them cost at the time. Some of the manufacturers contributed, some didn't. We raised this money, and I called. By that time there were two companies making it. It had been one company, Air Fence. It got upside down. It got reorganized. They had an outpost in Europe, which became Alpina, and they were still making stuff in Australia. We're sourcing it from Korea, but they were based in Australia. So I called up the guys at Alpina and I said, hey, I've got enough money to buy 35 sections of this stuff, but I need it at Road Atlanta by this date. And it was like a couple weeks. And the guy said, well, we can't do it that quickly. I said, okay, I'm going to buy it from Air Fence. And I called Air Fence and told them the same thing. And basically what happened was the Alpina guys moved deliveries around for other guys, and they got 20 sections to us in time for the AMA National at Road Atlanta. And the Air Fence guys got another 15 in time for the next AMA National at Roadramerica. And the first guy that hit Air Fence at an AMA Pro National that I saw was Grant Lopez, and he hit it coming out of the last corner at Road Atlanta, which was a pretty hairy place to crash. So anyway, we had 20 sections deployed at Road Atlanta, and we had 35 ready to deploy at Roadramerica. And we went down the road of, hey, we're paying for it. They don't have any excuse. All they got to do is deploy it. And so very reluctantly at first, AMA agreed to deploy it. And we went from there. And so over the years, we've raised over $2 million and bought Air Fence and supplied it to the National Series. I mean, we've supplied, you know, close to $1 million worth of stuff over the years to first AMA Pro Racing, and then to when DMG was running the series, to them, and now to MotoAmerica. And it's a really good thing. That stuff is a really good thing. And we've worked with different clubs. We worked with AFM. We've worked with CCS. We've worked with track day organizations who've done local fundraising to get soft barriers deployed at tracks they run at. Notable ones being N2 and PRE. And, you know, there's a lot of organizations we work with in that regard. And some of the racetracks have been transformed. Black Hawk Farms used to be really bad. Guys used to get helicoptered out of there all the time. And working with track day organizations, money's been raised to basically cover up almost all the bad spots of that place. And now they have races where guys don't get helicoptered out, and it's a great thing. So we've made a huge difference, you know, doing that project. And that's It's a nonprofit 501(c), and the change in how difficult or easy it was to work with organizations running the national series has been incredible. So I mean, in 2005, Vincent Haskell was riding for me, and he crashed at Sears Point, and he got into a tire wall in front of an Armco barrier. And I went to the race director at the time, Ron Barrick. I said, "How come you didn't have air fence there?" And he said, "Well, no one's ever hit that before," which is the same thing he told me when Grant crashed at Phoenix. And we didn't have enough. I said, "Well, how many did you deploy?" And I said, "I don't know. Why don't you ask the?" No, he said 42. I said, "Well, I gave you 65. Where's the rest of them?" Now, backing up some, I had been calling the guy running AMA Pro Racing at the time, and about 3 or 4 times a year, and I'd say, do you need more air fence? Can we send you more air fence? You need some air fence repaired. Is there anything we can do to help you with this? And the answer I got every single time was, "No, we're good. No, we're good. No, we're good." So I go, and he tells me to go talk to the guy who drives the air fence truck. And I say, "Hey, man, you guys deployed 42 sections here. I gave you 65. Where's the rest of them?" And he said, "Oh, they're back in a warehouse at AMA headquarters. They're damaged." "They're damaged? Your boss been telling me they're all fine." So then I learned that I had to just ship those guys stuff periodically and, send somebody to pick up the damaged ones and fix them, because they couldn't even be bothered to tell me, "Yes, we'll take some more." The DMG guys were better than that, but they would do stuff like, I would have Josh Hayes and Chris Ulrich go out with them to talk about where it's a good place to deploy stuff, consult on the deployment. So we're at RoadAmerica one time, and both of them agreed that it's about time to start sticking a couple of sections in front of the tire wall outside of turn 3. And the race director at the time was not Barrick, and the grid marshal, which I never even saw that grid marshal ride a motorcycle. I don't even know why she was even involved in the discussion. They said, "No, we don't need to put anything there. No one's going to hit that. They're never going to make that tire wall. They'll never get through the gravel trap." So that same weekend, Robertino Pietre is riding one of my motorcycles, and he gets really excited because he's like 7th in qualifying. He comes in for new tires. The guy's changed both tires on his bike. They drop it off the front stand, and the mechanic reaches to pump the front brake lever. In retrospect, he should have pumped that first. Drops the bike off the front stand, reaches for the lever. Robertino, meanwhile, has put it in gear and leaves. Goes down the whole pit lane without touching the front brake lever. Goes through turn 1 without touching the front brake lever. I never leave pit lane without pulling on the brake lever, but just to make sure. Rails down to turn 3, puts the brakes on, lever comes to the bar, pumps twice, doesn't get anything. The brakes didn't pump up that quick. Goes into the tire wall, buries himself in the tire wall. We had another case where Chris says, "We need one more section at the exit of the last corner at New Jersey." Race director says, "No, nobody can possibly get into that." Chris crashes in the Superbike race, goes into the tire wall, hurts his ankle. It was like that. People who should have known better, but were just idiots, would argue about deploying air fence in places where Josh Hayes and Chris Ulrich said they needed it. And I never understood it, because the cost of air fence or Alpina soft barriers is buying it and transporting it. Then you get to a race and you got day laborers assisting people who know how to deploy it. And you got to pay a day laborer's day labor rate, whether he deploys 2 or 20. So if you've got 65 in the truck, there's no reason not to deploy 65, unless you want to keep 1 for a backup or 2 for a backup, whatever. But you don't save any money by not deploying stuff. You just put riders at greater risk. So I never have understood that. Okay, so fast forward to MotoAmerica takes over. Thank God. An organization run by a racer, Wayne Rainey, and a racing guy and former racer Chuck Axelin, and hardcore enthusiast in Richard Varner, and a true motorsports guy in Terry Carges. Okay, so Doug Chandler is the race director. Chris Ulrich is consulting on air fence deployment. They have a conversation at the first time that the Road Racing World Action Fund supplied air fence was deployed at a standalone MotoAmerica race. It's at Road Atlanta. Should we put more air fence here? Do we have more in the truck? Yes, we have more in the truck. Okay, let's put some more here. That's the way it went. So, you know, it's not a perfect science, right? And sometimes you're going to find out the hard way that you should have put something in a particular place. And so at the Sears Point round last year, Josh Hayes had a bobble on the first lap of a 600 race and bumped into Sean Dillon Kelly, who veered off the track at a kind of a weird angle and got into a tire wall past where the air fence was deployed. So, you know, I see this and go, oh, that's bad. So I called Chuck Axelin, and so I say, hey, can you guys get more air fence up where Sean Dillon Kelly hit? And he said, it's already on its way. So that's the difference we have now. The safety thing has never been better. And that's a really, really good thing. So for the first time in history, during the time that I've been paying attention, I started riding motorcycles in about 69 and I started racing them in 73. We have a situation where when you're talking about rider safety, you're not blown off by somebody who, for some bizarre reason, doesn't want to deploy all the air fence or doesn't think anybody can get into something that they can or whatever. You got to actually go, you got an organization that's actually trying to make a very dangerous sport as safe as it can be. So that's a really, really good thing. Okay, what did I miss in your massive question with my massive answer?
Okay, we just set a new lap record. We just set a new lap record for the longest podcast in the history of the world. And John, I appreciate that. But John, you're going to have to keep this answer a little shorter, but I won't ask you as long a question as Sean did because I'm not Sean, and Sean likes to ask long questions. You've taken over the Suzuki Superbike team. Now, you guys, Team Hammer's been racing for a long, long time as we've gone through on this podcast.
40 consecutive years. 40 consecutive
there you go,
years.
40 consecutive years. So I was like 2 years old when you started. Okay, I wasn't. Okay, so anyway, so what's the difference now? I mean, does it feel like a lot bigger project to you? Does it feel like the same as you've always done? I mean, put some perspective into the fact that you guys are now running the Superbike team in MotoAmerica.
Well, first off, I want to say that, it's not something we were looking to do. We thought we were going down for a meeting to renew our support team thing, and we were going to do the same thing we were doing, which is basically concentrating on 600. And we ran one Superbike because Suzuki needed a home for Jake Lewis when he got bumped off the Yoshimura team by Toni Elias after being injured. So they were supporting him, us running him on a Superbike, but we were basically planned on doing other classes as normal, business as usual. I mean, in 2019, we won the Super Sport Championship with Bobby Fong, and we won the Twins Cup Championship with Alex Dumas, another one of our young up-and-comers, another 17-year-old. And we thought that's what we were going to be doing. And all the next thing you know, we're signing, non-disclosure agreements and being ushered in a conference room, and we're told you're going to be asked a yes or no answer, and there's only one or other answer. It's either yes or no. So I'm looking across the table with this guy, and he says, "Can you run our Superbike program?" And I got this feeling. I just had this feeling that if I said no, they were going to quit entirely. And I found out later that was exactly the case. So I kind of swallowed and said yes. And so that's how that happened. And so basically their situation was they were, they obviously need to spend less money. And this is cyclical. We've seen motorcycle manufacturers come in and come out countless times. I mean, Wayne Rainey won the Superbike Championship in 1983 on a 2-valve air-cooled Kawasaki against the V4 water-cooled 4-valve Hondas, which is a great achievement. Kawasaki put out a press release basically congratulating him and saying, we're not selling enough street bikes, we quit. So he's racing a TZ250, stock TZ250 the next year in Europe. But anyway, so manufacturers come in and come out. Okay, basically they get in situations where they're spending a lot of money, spending, funding, a spending war, and then the management changes or something changes, and they need to do something else and spend less money. And so historically, they've usually quit. Sometimes they've outsourced stuff. So the current trend is Yamaha outsourced to Attack, Suzuki outsourced to Team Hammer. So that's how that happened. It's a massively bigger thing, trying to run 2 superbikes. They're very, very complicated. All the parts are really, really expensive. They got all sorts of electronics on it. You need more geeks to run them. And we got them late, and they were missing a lot of parts, and we had to sort a lot of stuff out. And, I was really happy that the bike showed up at the preseason test after being on track one day previous, and that Toni, Elias, and Bobby Fong were fastest in one of the sessions on the first day, and Toni was fastest overall for the entire first day. So that was a very great relief. And when that happened, I turned to a guy who was there from Suzuki, and when Toni and Bobby were on the top of the monitor at the end of that particular session, I turned to him and said, "Well, apparently we do know what we're doing." So it's a massive undertaking, and very, very difficult. And I got a really good group of guys working for me. They did a great job at the shop under direction of Keith Perry, who's been our crew chief for over 30 years. And so far so good. We'll see what happens when the real racing starts.
All right. Well, we are going to have to put an end to this. I think we need to get back together, and we could go through the 90s, and then we could go through the 2000s and the 2010s, and then we could work our way up to 2020. But I think we definitely need more time with you. Unfortunately, we've gone over an hour, and we can't go much more than that. But John, I appreciate you joining us. And Wayne was hoping that you and I would get in a fight, and we didn't. So that's another reason why we have to do another one. So we'll get around to fighting in another podcast soon. But thanks for joining us, and stay healthy and safe in these difficult times. And the best of luck to your team. And hopefully, for God's sakes, we can go racing here pretty soon.
Yeah. Good luck to us all.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.